The bells of Notre Dame have tolled for Jacques Chirac. The cathedral honoring a tradition for the state funeral of the former French president, Chirac, a figure whose popularity was proven yet again by the long lines that extended till dawn so citizens could file past his coffin one last time. Why the popular outpouring for a leader who's been, well, out of the limelight for over a decade and who wasn't always so popular when in office? With all living French presidents in attendance at the funeral, we'll reflect on Chirac's place in history. Chirac's years were the time when politics revolved around big tent center-right and center-left parties. It was the post-Cold War years, too. Among world leaders past and present, Russia's Vladimir Putin and former US President Bill Clinton, the current occupant of the White House, sending no major emissary to Paris. We'll ask why, and since life does go on, we'll also ask what sort of sidelines diplomacy this moment perhaps offered. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Chirac era. Joining us is attorney and magistrate Noël Lenoir, who served as European Affairs Minister under Jacques Chirac. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
She advised Jacques Chirac when he was mayor of Paris, when he was prime minister. Investment consultant Marie-Hélène Bérard, thank you for being with us.
Merci.
Andrei Grachev, former spokesperson for the former Soviet head of state Mikhail Gorbachev, thank you for being with us.
Welcome.
Your latest book, A New Pre-War Era, is it published in English yet?
Not yet. It's written in French and it's published in French. It's not published in Russian so far.
So far. Okay, so you're hoping to see it in Russian and in English, perhaps. Also with us, he's the co-founder of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, Dominique Moisy. Your latest book, the new, how would you say it? The new world imbalance.
Not the latest, but one before the last, yes.
Okay, what's your latest? Tell us.
It's called Leçons de Lumière, Lessons of Enlightenment.
Okay, and it's about?
It's about Europe, it's about ethics, it's about democracy.
All right, democracy, which is being tested these days, and that was one of the subjects of conversation that came up in sidebar conversations at this funeral. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Jacques Chirac's been laid to rest in a private ceremony at Paris's Montparnasse Cemetery. This day began with military honors, a ceremony in the courtyard of the National Armory, the Invalides. And with Notre Dame closed for renovation, it was then on to the state funeral at the left bank Saint-Sulpice Church. Camille Derek has more.
Outside the church of Saint-Sulpice, crowds gathered to say a last goodbye to Jacques Chirac. Giant screens were set up so that they could follow along with the service, as world leaders, both past and present, took their seats in the church, including President Vladimir Putin, Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri and former US President Bill Clinton. Jacques Chirac's old colleagues were also in attendance, including Dominique de Villepin, Nicolas Sarkozy and Alain Juppé. A notable absence, his wife Bernadette, for reasons of ill health. The rest of his family were in the front row. The pallbearers were Chirac's former bodyguards. The service was opened with the Archbishop's greeting to the world leaders and the Chirac family, before lighting a candle to represent eternal life.
Our former president, this warm man supported by his wife Bernadette, a true love for others, as at ease in the Élysée Palace as at an agriculture conference. Many who met him felt valued. He had a deep love for his family.
Prayers were interspersed with choral music, both solemn and uplifting. And the Argentinian pianist Daniel Barenboim played a piece by Frank Schubert. Outside, as the crowd watched on, it was a chance to reflect on what made the former president so loved.
I was fortunate enough to meet him. He was a very good man, a kind man. I'll always remember him with fondness. He was close to the French people.
His final resting place is the Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris.
The last time, Marine and Bérard, that there was a state funeral of this kind was 1996 when François Mitterrand died. You were inside the church this morning and as well at the National Armory at the Invalides. What was the mood like for you?
The mood was different. The mood in the first mass at Saint-Louis des Invalides, it was the family, the close friends. Madame Chirac was there, and some of his, let's say, former collaborators. And the mood was very, very quiet, very sad. Saint-Sulpice was something different. 2,000 people, much more official, with foreign states, head of foreign states attending. As you said, Vladimir Putin was there, Bill Clinton was there, many others. The President of Georgia, Salome Zourabichvili, was there. Many African head of states. It was much more official, solemn, beautiful. But it was not the same feeling.
France is one of these countries where there's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of the president. So a funeral like this one, you might say it's almost unique for Europe?
I think it is unique for Europe. I think for two main reasons. First, as you said, the president, by the constitution, has very large powers in France. So even a former president, he's still somebody. But also Chirac, though he has been silent for a long time after his presidency ended in 2007. Now it's 2019. Though he has been silent and not at all involved, or at least publicly involved, in the French politics, he was still present in the mind of people.
It's been something else, Noël Lenoir. All weekend we saw people, ordinary citizens who went to the Invalides to walk past the casket one last time, pay their respects. The words you've been hearing since the news broke last Thursday, do they correspond to the man that you knew sitting in cabinet meetings?
Yes, of course. Well, I must say that I attended also the funeral of François Mitterrand years ago, and the atmosphere was quite different. It was much more solemn, even, and there were much less people in the streets. This time, I think that there are two phenomena. First of all, Chirac, apart from his policy, is a man who loved the French. He knew them extremely well because he has been in politics such a long time.
That is true.
And he went around France meeting with people. He loved that. So the people feel it. And I must say that as a minister, he was very kind. And also, as you know, he was very much in favor of a more political Europe. But at the same time, he had some words vis-à-vis the Eastern countries, which were not yet member states of Europe. And then he had to meet these people at the Élysée Palace, one by one, and he seduced them all, except the Polish.
So he was a charmer.
He was a charmer.
Oh, he was a charmer.
And I must say that he was a charmer. Why is it so? Because he listened to people, and as is the case with some other politicians, he never talked about himself, but only on the others. He listened to them, and he made the people feel not only secure, but be taken into consideration. And I think that this human relationship is something which is felt in the country as well. And the second point I must insist on is that the French people need to gather and to have more unity instead of being led by these extremist political parties, which hopefully was not attending the funerals.
Yeah, well, that was actually one of the points. Dominique Moisy, as Noël Lenoir is saying, we project, right? We're talking about the years when he was in power, which was more than a decade ago, but we're looking at it through the eyes of 2019. The Chirac family saying they did not want the leader of the far right, Marine Le Pen, who made the second round of the presidential election in 2017, to be in attendance. Was that the right call? Refusing to let Marine Le Pen be present at the funeral?
Personally, I think so. I think you ask your first question, why such a treatment? Because in Europe, the French president is alone in his category. He has symbolic power, he's like the Queen of England, and he has real power. He's like the Prime Minister of England, and he's both. And in the case of the popular affection, on the one hand, you can understand it personally. I remember two persons in my life whom I felt empathy with at a huge level. Bill Clinton, he would take you in his arms, you would feel the most important person on earth, and Jacques Chirac. And it's interesting that they're both, that Bill
Clinton was present today.
That Bill Clinton was present today. On the other hand, I think the outpouring of sympathy for an emotion for Jacques Chirac is also a kind of implicit criticism of the three presidents that succeeded him. They felt this man could represent us, which was not the case with Sarkozy, which was not the case with François Hollande, and which is slightly more difficult with Emmanuel Macron.
We forget that he had a very tough run of it in 2002 when he was reelected.
Yeah.
He was often criticized. There were those big strikes.
Yeah.
People seem to forget that today,
Yes,
and they
yes.
just remember the man.
Yeah, no, not only the man. I think, and this is a very important point, which is linked to your question. I think he was the man of the Veldiv speech. He was the man of the refusal.
Recognizing France's role in
Culpability.
Guilt
in deporting Jews.
The French state guilt. He was the man, of course, of saying no to the war in Iraq. But he was also, and today, the ultimate dam, the wall against extremism. And this is, in a way, why his commemoration today is very much a political act. It's saying no to the extremism that are threatening the Republic.
All right, and Noël Lenoir, regretting that that politics are more polarized today, in an interview with State Radio, France Inter, the former French president François Hollande paid tribute to a politician who Hollande says learned to listen to his own heart over time.
He made choices that weren't those of his own party, on the death penalty, in vitro fertilization, and the fight against the far right. He didn't do it to provoke, he did it because he felt it within him.
There's this idea of that Jacques Chirac learned to listen to his own heart late in political life, because his career spanned over 4 decades. He would. Your thoughts, André Grachev, on why this outburst of sympathy, of grieving?
Well, I'm tempted to say that there should have been a special explanation of this kind of link between Chirac and Russia and Russian leaders at the time of his presence in Élysée, because for the French, for the Russians, what is important is not only, let's say, the political rationality, which was certainly there, the Gaullist tradition, which was naturally present in some of the actions taken by
the Gaullist tradition, which is to position yourself between the two superpowers of the Cold War.
But also, the feeling, the warmth, the personality, which is behind the rationality. For Russians, what counted with Chirac, not only the fact that he had the legend of being almost fluent in Russian,
Which
or
is not a legend. No, he was speaking Russian.
well, let me judge, because I had a conversation with him.
Okay.
So now, but then certainly Russians are seduced by this information that even in his younger years he tried to translate Pushkin into French, and things of this kind count very much for the Russians. But then comes the dry rationality of politics, and I think that from this point of view, Chirac would remain in the history of French-Russia's relations, certainly as the man who, let's say, involved Russia at the time of this troika, of this trio of Chirac, Schroeder, and Putin, in a collective action that certainly not only was rational at that time, it was brave, it was courageous, and it was true and correct, and the correctness of this action has been confirmed with the time that passed.
Yeah, and
you are totally right, because the three of us had a real action. I mean, between them, they were friends, they trust each other, and what they did for the few years they were in power at the same time is really meaningful.
Yeah, and there was Bill Clinton saying that it was Jacques Chirac who pushed to have, when Boris Yeltsin was president, to have Russia included in the G8.
Well, I think that Chirac, in that respect, was the heir of Gaullism, in the way that he wanted France to be great, not great again, but the third way. And I've accompanied Chirac in Russia in 2001. I was not yet minister. And he said to Putin, I want to see Yeltsin. So he went to see Yeltsin, where Yeltsin was completely out. I think that one thing that characterizes Chirac, he likes people very much when they are weak, and he wants to show that he takes them into consideration. Is it a political strategy or not? I don't think it is 100% a political strategy, but he is somebody who takes care of people, especially when they are not well. And I think that was accepted at the time because Yeltsin had no power at all, but he made it very officially. And he stayed with Yeltsin. I think that they shared some vodka, I hope so, sometime. And that shows that he had an emotional relationship with chiefs of state and governments. And as you know, he didn't go well at all with Tony Blair, for instance, which explains also what he did when he
and why perhaps Tony Blair was absent this Monday. We're going to come back to the fact that his funeral, bringing Vladimir Putin back to France for the second time in 2 months, and what that implies looking forward. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the national tribute, the state funeral that's been taking place for France's former president, Jacques Chirac, in the company of Noël Lenoir, who served as European Affairs Minister under the late French president. Also with us, Marie-Hélène Bérard, who advised Chirac when he was mayor of Paris, when he was prime minister. In his first incarnation, second incarnation, as prime minister. What a long political career.
Absolutely. It was his second time prime minister. It was the first cohabitation.
Right.
I mean, having a
the
president.
first time you had power sharing under.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was the first experience.
André Grachev, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po, and who is the former spokesperson for the former Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Welcome back. And welcome back as well to Dominique Moisy, the co-founder of the French Political Science Institute, IFRI, the Institute for French International Relations think tank. We were talking just before the break about the big draw, you might say, among current leaders around the world at this funeral, Vladimir Putin, when he took over for Boris Yeltsin in 2000. Well, it was the days of cowboy capitalism in the former Soviet Union. And Chirac, who, as André Grachev said, had learned Russian when he was young, understood the importance of reaching out. This past June, Putin singled out Chirac as the living world leader who impressed him most. In an interview with the Financial Times, he stated, he's a true intellectual, a real professor, a very level-headed man. When he was president, he had his own opinion on every issue. He knew how to defend it, and he always respected his partner's opinion. Jacques Chirac, again, Putin comes in. It wasn't the days of. We're not 2019. This is a long time ago.
Absolutely.
What was the mindset when he makes that first trip to Moscow after Putin becomes president?
I do remember this trip. I mean, we were part of it. And it was, I mean, Chirac was very respectful. Putin was a new guy coming in. We are speaking of the same period, right? And Chirac was very full of attention, trying not to show off. Anyway, Chirac very rarely showed off. He was a modest person, Chirac, as he is. And he was very full of attention, full of giving advices, but without really, again, showing that he was giving advices.
So why all this gushing praise? Let me ask you, Andrei Grachev, why in that interview with the Financial Times does he single out Jacques Chirac as the one living leader at the time? This was at the end of June. Why does he do?
Well, it's difficult for me to guess what's in the head of Vladimir Putin because sometimes his expressions they leave people a bit embarrassed. Quite a while ago, for example, he regretted the fact that since the death of Mahatma Gandhi, he doesn't have people to talk with. So apparently Chirac, in a way, was one of his
counterpart.
Yes, beloved contacts. But I think what should have touched him, not only what you referred to, the fact that Chirac was very tactful, a man with great experience and a great, at the same time, attention.
And modesty.
But attention which I think was showing the great respect of Chirac towards Russia.
Absolutely.
Towards Russia as a strategic, historic, and geopolitical entity which has to be treated with great respect.
Absolutely.
Whoever is at the head of Russia.
Absolutely.
And from this point of view,
Absolutely.
I think this feeling between the two was also felt by Putin.
You are right.
Dominique Moisy, after the funeral, there's this reception that takes place later in the day on Monday at the French presidential palace at the Élysée. And there's Putin, who's seeing Emmanuel Macron for the second time in 2 months. His presence in Paris, what do you do if you're Emmanuel Macron and you're sitting down with Putin again?
Well, there's a sense of confirming the rapprochement that is taking place between Moscow and Paris. And in a way, Macron is using Chirac, saying, well, he did it before me. You may not like me. You love Chirac, but I'm doing the same thing as Chirac, even in foreign policy terms. And I think to understand the thinking, the reasoning of Jacques Chirac in 2000, when he meets for the first time Vladimir Putin, you have to integrate the humiliation of the Russian after 10 years, nearly 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And here he comes and he says, I'll take you seriously, not like the Americans, not like the British. I know that behind the incarnation that existed with Yeltsin, there is eternal Russia. So from that standpoint, he's very Gaullist.
So you're looking at that meeting at the Élysée Palace. Are you nervous if you're Ukraine watching it after we've seen all the events in the United States the past week? Is Macron, what is his objective at this point?
To have a normal relationship with Russia and to try to integrate Russia more closely with Europe. But I would not panic either if I were someone from Latvia or Estonia or even Ukraine. There's Europe.
You agree with that, Noël Lenoir?
I think that Putin appreciated to be the one who was taken in respect by Chirac. And I must say that there are, of course, the Russian institutions are not like the French ones, but they have the same role as president of a country. And really, I think that the attitude of the Americans, perhaps it is something which you are going to talk about.
Well, we'll talk about it right now. The Trump administration was represented today by its ambassador to France. They waited till Sunday evening to put out a statement by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. It's a very, bland statement, says we'll never forget that Chirac was the first head of state to travel to the U.S. after the horrible attack of September 2001. And you're just left wondering, did they not send a higher level delegation because of France's no to the Iraq war, or just because right now it's such chaos back in Washington that this is not high on their priority list?
I think it is both. I'm struck to see that the articles in the press, in the American press, are not very good, which shows that the diplomacy not only...
Not very good in what sense?
In the sense that they are very critical, they are very negative about Chirac. They say he's a politician and he was corrupt, etc. So I think that it shows that, unfortunately for us and for them, the American leadership is weakening. And of course, for France, it's just, to see what is happening in the US, because I think that, in fact, I've lived that with Bush. Chirac and Bush were not antagonized at all. I remember that Chirac, at the time when he decided not to support the intervention in Iraq, he said openly, I'm fully aware it'll be a very, very tough situation for France, but he considered, as an old politician, knowing quite well the situation in the Middle East, that it was just turmoil, and that's why he didn't intervene. But it was not
his prophecy turned out right.
anti-American. He was not anti-American. I can testify. He considered that he was not subordinate to the Americans, as de Gaulle did, but he was not anti-American. And I think, I'm not to judge American diplomacy, but it shows that they are very weak. And
shows that they're
it's
very
a very
weak?
bad signal.
You agree with that, Marie-Hélène Perard?
No, I don't think they are weak, unfortunately. They don't look very clever, but they are not weak at all. If you refer to what the Americans are doing as regarding the sanctions, the extraterritorial...
Sanctions against Iran.
Sanctions against Iran, Russia, and Cuba. And the extraterritoriality of those sanctions, which apply not only to the American citizens, but to everybody in the world.
Yes, but it has nothing to do with Trump. It has always been like that.
Absolutely.
This is different.
It is
the power of the first big power in and for corruption as well.
Yes, but
it's not Trump's speciality.
No,
I think that
it is not his speciality. As
because
it was
the public opinion,
as a regulation, it was existing before. But
it dates back to the 90s.
96. But the first precedent we had was only, let's say, sorry for example, the small Cuba. And now what is specific to Trump is that it is enrolling two big cases. One is Russia and one is Iran. And on those two cases, we as Europeans do not agree. Even if we have some sanctions against Russia as European Union, they are not at all the same as the American sanctions. So yes, the regulation was pre-existing, absolutely true, but the way it is used and the power of OFAC in the United States is more and more important.
Andrzej Grachev?
Yeah, I would say, going back to the, let's say, to the importance of Chirac's legacy, is that sometimes, and especially with outstanding leaders, you have this great paradox that sometimes even their absence, or rather their death, may contribute to encourage politics or, let's say, to influence politics. In this sense, for example, even 10 years after, Chirac has left his place in Élysée, the rightness of his action taken at the time of the American and British invasion of Iraq has proved during this time. And the same concerns relations of Europe and Russia. And from this point of view, in a certain sense, Chirac, who is no more with us for already more than 10 years, in a way, not only he confirms the rightness of the necessity to reintegrate Russia in Europe, which was, by the way, the tonality of the last speech of Macron before the ambassadors.
Exactly.
So, in a way, let us say, the specter of Chirac is wandering, across the space. And from this point of view, I think he helps the section of Macron, which may be considered as controversial even in his camp, not only in Europe, but inside France.
Dominique Moisy.
Well, two things. The first one, I find very ironic that the American press speaks of Chirac today the way the French spoke about Chirac in 2007 when he left power. That's a very interesting phenomenon. The second part is that clearly Jacques Chirac was no anti-American.
No.
In fact, he was deeply right in 2003 and tried between 2003 and 2005 to make up relationship with America. He was right in content. Maybe the style of Dominique de Villepin's speech was too flamboyant in the United Nations, and maybe the campaign led in Africa against the American action was too strong, especially coming 2 years after 9/11. But Jacques Chirac understood that. And in fact, in 2005, Condoleezza Rice came to Paris, was received magnificently, gave a beautiful speech at Sciences Po, and the relationship between France and the United States were restored. So the American press today is dating.
Dominique Moisy, on this point, there was another absent this Monday, raised some eyebrows. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel was absent. Now, our correspondent called the Chancellery, Nick Spicer called the Chancellery, and they said, well, Germany's represented by its president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier.
He was there.
So is that not a big deal, or is it a big deal, the fact that Merkel was absent?
No, the fact that Schröder was not there is, to a large extent, more surprising.
Yeah, he'd been announced, and then apparently there was a mix-up in giving him the invitation.
Yeah, we don't know what happened. We don't know what happened.
But it's a mistake.
Yeah.
Whatever happened, it's a mistake, but let's say a formal mistake. It's not...
Because some were already speculating. He's a little bit reviled, Gerhard Schröder, for having taken this position as chairman of Gazprom for Vladimir Putin.
Yes. And this reminds me of a wonderful story of Vladimir Putin, Gerhard Schröder, and Jacques Chirac being together and speaking of... Yes. But I think the fact that Schröder didn't come is just... a mistake, not his mistake, but our mistake from the French side. I think there is something we didn't do right.
No, well, I'm not... Well, Schröder is a specific case. I don't understand why he didn't come. Well, of course, his reputation, what he did, because I remember that a few days before leaving power, he said that Russia was the pure democracy, the purest democracy in the world. It was a bit too much. So it's not a signal for me, just odd with regard to himself.
He was a good friend, a close
Merkel,
friend.
I think that, Merkel had no real relationships. I received Merkel a lot of times. At the time, Villepin didn't want to meet with her because she was only the head of the CDU and it was not his level. So I saw her very, very often. But Chirac didn't see her so much. Yeah. I think it's not a signal for the German. No. I persist to say that for the Americans, it is a bit worrying for the Europeans because Chirac was really, and it was a bit surprising coming from a Gaullist, was really very pushing with regard to Europe. And it is with Clinton that we have the last president being really supportive of the EU.
Well, let's
and I think it's more problematic with regard to the...
Let's listen to Bill Clinton, who was present in Paris this Monday for the funeral, the former U.S. president who spoke to France 24's Clovis Caselli.
Jacques was still around. I liked having him out there plugging along. But and this is It's an interesting thing because we didn't agree on everything politically, but these are where people on the right, left, people on the right should be able to agree that diverse groups make better decisions than lone geniuses.
That diverse groups make better decisions than lone geniuses. Dominique Moisy, of course, everybody's projecting, look how polarized it is right now in Britain, in France, in the United States, everywhere, it seems. Are those days of, moderate politics gone for good?
Well, there is a president in France who is the spokesman for moderation. So you can't say it has all gone. But it's clear that the world that Bill Clinton incarnated together with Jacques Chirac was a world of multilateralism, of bipolarity or unipolarity at that time. He was the last president of the 20th century. And to a large extent, so was, in a way, Jacques Chirac. They both incarnated a world that's no longer there.
All right, finally, and I want to first of all thank Noël Lenoir, André Grachev, Dominique Moisy, and Marie-Hélène Bérard for being with us. Finally, it wouldn't be complete if we didn't have a salute to the man who made sure France 24 happened. It was December the 6th, 2006, Jacques Chirac on hand alongside our founding station CEO, Alain Pouzillac. It was opening night. The then president who saw the cable news revolution and pushed for a CNN à la française. I remember that night well. Chirac shook my hand, as well as the hand of every single other person in the building with the same gusto as during that first campaign meet back in 1967. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, looking obviously at the many, many remarks and images from today's ceremonies. And it is interesting to see that there are some very different scenes out there. I think this photograph is probably my favourite one of all. It really is very evocative, very moving. I'm not sure who took it, unfortunately, so I can't tell you that. But the other thing that I noticed as I was watching this happen live as well is this is the moment where we realised this was very much a 21st century funeral, because you do actually notice some of the people in this photograph holding up their mobile phones to snap a quick picture as the coffin was coming down the aisle. I know a lot of people will feel that was very disrespectful. Not everyone's doing it, but it was interesting to note that that was happening at such a solemn occasion.
Did you have the sense it was a 21st century funeral?
Yes, I agree with that, and I disagree with the people who took pictures, but this is another story.
Looking elsewhere, another very striking image came up on Twitter, this one. It's by a journalist, TV journalist, Laurence Saillet. She was at Saint-Sulpice early on this morning and captured the morning light coming through the windows. And what she wondered was whether it could actually help lift our immense sadness, the sadness of the French nation. But she says nothing could, and her thoughts were with Bernadette Chirac, who would not be able to attend that funeral mass at Saint-Sulpice. Now, for some reason, my computer appears to be being a little tricky. Oh, there we go. I hope I can find the thing. There are a lot of concerns for Bernadette Chirac. She is, of course, 86 years old. She is not in the best of health, we are told, everyone describing her as very fragile, and we haven't seen her since the death of her husband of 63 years. We are told that it has hit her very hard, unsurprisingly, it has to be said. This image everyone's using actually comes from 2017, when she was at a memorial for Simone Weil. So a lot of people very concerned about Bernadette Chirac, which perhaps make it all the more shocking that Le Parisien has actually decided to go with this image. It appears to be the only French media to do so. I don't know if it was done with a drone. I don't know if it was done from a building over the road. We were told that he would be buried in the strictest privacy and that this would not be a public event, but somehow they have managed to capture this image. Nobody else seems to be using it. It is the moment you can see the coffin being lowered into the ground at Montparnasse Cemetery. So a little surprising, perhaps, that they've chosen to go down that route. Elsewhere, and slightly more respectfully, I think, this person tweeted this image showing that this is how the grave looks. This was taken before the ceremony happened. And it's interesting to note just how simple it is. It says merely Jacques Chirac and the years of his date of birth and his date of death. Nothing at all about him being the president. But I think a lot of people questioning really why that image has been used by Le Parisien, because he's being buried alongside his daughter who died in 2016. And it does seem to really have been going beyond the realm of what was called for at that particular moment. Today, for all the simplicity of this grave, of course, today was not without its pomp and circumstance. One of the most important moments culturally for France is perhaps the fact that we heard the bells of Notre Dame ring out.
Yes, and I heard they were rung manually because it's all broken there.
Absolutely. You're not able to use the electronic system, so they were rung by hand, and that's the first time that's happened since 1944, when they actually rang out to signify the liberation of Paris.
Wow.
So this is a real historical moment, and one that a lot of people really felt was rather lovely. Now, you've been speaking about the fact that Bill Clinton had some very warm words for his old friend, and they were very warm. This wasn't just diplomatic talk. He was very down to earth in describing him as a friend and saying, I'll miss him, I liked him, and I'll miss him. Interesting as well, the dangers of nationalism that he talked about, saying that he was always positive, upbeat, and very French, but in a way that didn't actually push people away. He was very proud and very defensive of all things French, but not in a way that actually stopped other people being part of that. He, of course, there as a former president of the United States, but the only representative there from today's administration was an ambassador, which some people have questioned, especially
Including
the fact
on this set.
Well, indeed, Donald Trump hasn't even tweeted about it, which is kind of unheard of. Pompeo, I've forgotten his first name.
U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo.
Yes, Michael, thank you. I wanted to call him Matt for some reason. Mike Pompeo did actually manage to tweet something late last night French time, so that took him over 2 days, nearly 3 days, to get around to tweeting this. And it is interesting when you consider the fact that Jacques Chirac was the first head of state to head out to the US while the Twin Towers were still smoking after 9/11. And a lot of people feeling that really it's been quite disrespectful of the US not to have talked about this much. We also haven't heard anything from George W. Bush. And some people wondering why. One place he hasn't been forgotten is over in Japan. The French national squad halted their training to carry out a minute's silence earlier today. They will be playing again on Wednesday, but took time out to remember the former head of state. And final image on this to end on. C'est loin, mais c'est beau. It's a cartoon from Bidou. It's a very well-known phrase that he used a lot, very fond of La France profonde, the deepest, darkest reaches of France. He used to say it a lot. It's a long way away, but it's beautiful. And of course, here he is saying it to God.
Right. Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. More coverage on Jacques Chirac's funeral on our website, france24.com.